lecture. I'm also giving the 2NR lecture tomorrow for all of you. So you already know who I am. I'm Eric Lanning. But this lecture is really just part one of the 2NR lecture for a number of reasons that we're going to discuss at the beginning of here. There's really no point in talking about each of the negative speeches individually, right? Even though you have a lecture slot for all of them, you should think of this as negative strategy part 2. So you already got some thoughts of this from Young, but we're going to really just build on setting up a successful 2NR. Right? The whole point of the block is to overcome some of the advantages that the affirmative has strategically in the debate. So this is not necessarily, it doesn't matter what speaker position you are, it doesn't matter whether you get the 2NC or the 1NR. The point of this lecture is to get you ready to give a successful 2NR, which is what we're going to talk about tomorrow morning. So one thing that we like to say is the block, the two speeches back to back, are a defining feature of what makes policy debate different than most other forms of debate. So there's a lot of strategic significance to the way that the block is set up that it's important to understand. The fact that there are two speeches back to back creates a number of effects on the rest of the debate. So I like to say that the block is the negative's 2AR. And what I mean by that is the negative's chance to over-explain things, to unpack things, to be very persuasive, to spend some time just talking to the judge and making connections. And so a lot of times in the 2AR, the affirmative gets a strategic benefit from making choices about one part of the debate. So for instance, for example, if before you were answering the dissent and the counterclaim and also going for conditionality, if you're affirmative in the last speech, you can choose to just go for one of those, right? So you can narrow down the debate. So the block, ironically, serves the opposite function for the negative. It's where they make their choices, but they often have to leave a couple because in the 2NR you just don't have as much flexibility to do that. So based off some of that kind of like ramble so far, but why wouldn't the 2NR, the last negative speech, be the equivalent of the 2AR? Why would I say that the negative block is that the affirmative is the equivalent of the 2AR? Anyway. What makes the 2NR and the 2AR different?
The 2NR, just due to the position of having to answer 5 minutes of offense and preempt 5 minutes of offense, you don't have a bunch of time to like explain all your arguments.
You have to answer and predict. So the 2AR has the benefit of speaking last, which overcomes the advantage of the block. So I mentioned earlier the strategic implications of having two negative speeches back to back instead of having alternating speeches. Most other speech events just have alternating speeches. They don't have a negative block. So the persuasive benefit of speaking last means you get to choose what the debate is about at the end. Right? So if there are 10 little mini debates happening, you're the 2AR, you can choose 3 of them and eject the other 7 and still potentially win. The 2NR does not have that luxury. The 2NR has to answer every argument that's in the debate, including different combinations of different arguments. So the 2NR is by far the most difficult speech and most time-pressured speech. So the way that you give a successful 2NR is by giving a good negative block. One thing that I'm going to say repeatedly in the next lecture that we have tomorrow morning is think backwards. Think backwards. Any problem that I never will give you advice if I'm watching a debate that you were just in about the 2NR. I would never be like, oh, change this thing about your 2NR, change this thing about your 2NR. It all starts with the 1NC. All of the changes necessary to make an effective 2NR to win on the negative start earlier in the debate. If you are having a problem executing at the end of a debate when you are negative, it is likely something that can be fixed earlier in the debate. So the 2NR is simply too difficult to stack up next to the 2AR. So, and the final sort of introductory thought about the negative block, what makes it distinct from just other strategic advice in debate, is you have to win in the block if you are negative. You do not have the luxury of winning at the end of the debate. And a lot of times when you're negative, you have to have a couple of winning strategies in the block in order to offset the affirmative. The reason the 2NR is so difficult in sort of like simple, concrete terms is because it is preceded by and followed by an affirmative speech. So it's sandwiched between 2 affirmative speeches. The 1AR happens, the 2NR happens, and then the 2AR happens. It's surrounded. The negative block offsets that by giving you a bunch of time to talk together. So the first thing that I want to talk about for the negative block is some of the strategic advice that you're going to hear me ranting a lot about. Think backwards. So where do you start them? So the first thing is a strategic 1NC. I'm not going to re-summarize all of Kwan's lecture, but I do think that it is important to think about what makes a strategic 1NC, and balance is the most important, right? Giving yourself a number of options going forward. And what I mean by this is that things that are unconnected to each other, you all should just come up and sit in a real seat, even though you're late. Hiding at the back doesn't make you not late. You're still hiding. That's strange. Okay, so you want to give yourself a number of options that are unrelated to each other. So things that, if you lose the debate that's happening on one sheet of paper, you could still go for something else. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about single sheet of paper or self-contained offense. An argument that is distinct from the things that are happening around us. So like topicality is a great example of this, right? You can lose the disad, right? You can lose the disadvantage, you can lose your critique, but still win the debate because the affirmative wasn't topical. This is something that when you are negative is isolated from the rest of your strategy, so you're not going to lose just because of something that happened somewhere else. So, in the negative block, it is important to give yourself at least 2 options. And what I mean by at least 2 options is 2 completely distinct strategies, not just combinations of strategies. So being like the disad is one and the counterplan is the other. Is a counterplan by itself a strategy? Maybe, trick question. It could if it has its own net benefit. So like the consultation counterplan, like we should consult our allies in Europe before we change surveillance programs because it affects them deeply and they want input in it, and that's key to relations with them. That could all be on one sheet of paper. It's one argument, and you could win on just that, right? Yes. So you have to ask, it's not just like a simple, like you can't just have a checklist of each of these counts as an option. Sometimes topicality is not self-contained. What if you read 2 topicality arguments that are the opposite of each other? What could the other team do? Could they potentially cross-apply something from one to the other? Yes. So a lot of times in these lectures, people will be like, here's a list of things, right? No, you need to think more intuitively about this. What are all of the different combinations of arguments that you could put together for later in the debate? So putting together a good 1 and C is about listing out different 2 and R's that you could give. So when I'm coaching teams, one of the first questions I ask them are, what are our potential 2 and R's? So if you are negative, what would you like to say in the last speech? Well, our first option would be to go for the capitalism critique. And my follow-up question would be, what if that goes wrong? Like, what if that's not good? Well, the second option will be to go for the counterplan and the politics disad. What if that doesn't go right? Well, we'll go for D. So that sequence of events is important. The next major question is the division of labor. Who is going to take what, when, and for how long? Answering that question is basically what getting ready to be negative is. That's what you should spend most of your prep time doing before a negative debate. Who is going to take what, for how long, and when? As opposed to, what should we read against this affirmative? Does it make sense? Do you see how that's a different question? So when you're preparing, I think one of the most important things for about executing on the block is the 2N should already have highlighted and already have thought through what the 1 and C's are going to be. So kind of like the sequence, think about it as like the sequence of these lectures. Before a debate, you should not be like, what should we put in our 1 and C, right? If you're like really prepared, so at the National Debate Tournament, the teams that I was coaching already had their 1 and C's ready for particular teams unless it was something new. So as soon as we got the pairing, they're like, oh, we're debating this team. 3 weeks ago, we decided that this is what we would read if they read this affirmative, right? And so the conversation before the debate when you're prepping starts sort of like fast forwarded. It's not a question of what should you put in there, it's a question of how are we going to divide and who's going to extend what that we're going for. So the division of labor, what goes where? Things to think about. Factors that would determine which speech. Does everyone understand what I mean when I say what goes where? So the 2 and C versus the 1 and R. What are the major strategic considerations that would make you put something in one of those speeches versus the other? Why do we split the block in particular ways? What are the reasons why, or what informs that decision?
I mean, if you're going for like a goofy critical argument that needs a lot of explanation, it should probably be in the 2 and C to do.
Why? What about the 2 and C makes explanation easier than the 1 and R?
Like 3 extra minutes of time to explain it.
I guess.
And cross-X afterwards.
Is cross-X afterwards good or bad for something that's complicated?
It depends on how well you know it.
Sure, everything always depends, right? If you recall from my previous lecture, no universal advice in debate. Everything that anyone ever tells you in one of these lectures should be situated in a context, right? Sometimes it's not strategic to do the thing that makes the most sense. What if your judge is really dumb? Does it make sense? Like, why would you make really smart decisions? You know, everything has a time and a place. There's no such thing as universal advice in debate. It's not algebra. You can't say x plus y equals whatever. Yes, but what about the cross-X is so particular? What type of arguments do we want them to cross-X about? What type of arguments do we not want them to ask questions about? Yes, Maluka.
Like your good arguments, so like if it's a K that makes no sense, they get 3 minutes to embarrass you on it.
What if you're really good at cross-X?
I mean,
See, this is why I don't like this standard advice. The standard advice, which you can write down, is to put your bad arguments in the 1 and R, because they don't get cross-X. right? So people will always, you would actually probably, for most people that weren't me here in this lecture, you should put politics in the 1 and R because cross-ex. I always took politics in the 2 and C for 9 minutes when I was debating. Literally every single time that I debated at Michigan State, that was my 2 and C. So the opposite of the advice you would hear in most of these lectures, because I was very good at cross-ex, and I wanted them to cross-ex us about it. They were like, oh, politics is really stupid. We'll cross-ex Lanning about it and get nothing out of it. It was a waste of their 3 minutes. And I was bad at kicking out of stuff, so I made my partner do that. So it's always particular, right? But generally, you should be thinking about the cross-ex. Does that make sense? So if you're good at cross-ex and you want to, perhaps what if you're better than your partner? What if you're the 2 and C and your partner is younger and you're still teaching them, they're still learning, right? Would you want to give them an argument that's harder to explain even if they didn't have to cross-ex about it? No. Also, people ask questions during prep time now. That's another thing that happens. I don't know. I think that the biggest thing that should go into your mind is your particular strengths and weaknesses for division of labor. Generally, the question that you're asking yourself is, where should our primary offense versus primary defense go? So one problem that you'll have when you're younger is in some of your debates, your opponents just won't answer anything, and so you will choose to extend everything. Everything that was in the 1 and C should be in the block when? When should that happen? Never. Basically never. Remember, backwards in time to when we learned about the 1 and C, you want to give yourself lots of options. Do you want to execute on all of those options? Okay, so I'm going to the Sadie Hawkins dance. I want to find 3 different boys that I think are cute to ask them. Okay, I've got them all lined up, and then I ask all 3 of them. Is that going to be an effective strategy? No. No. You have to make a choice. So as we get closer, does it make sense? You want to have lots of options in the beginning, but do not necessarily want to pursue all of them. The same is true for the negative block, even if your opponents drop everything. So narrow down. Who should take what, though? The cross-ex is one thing that we've already talked about. If it's an argument that's not very good at surviving a cross-ex, it should go in the 1 and R. If it's an argument you want to spend more time talking about or explaining, it should probably go in the 2 and C. If it's an argument you're likely to go for in the 2 and R, where should it go? Trick question. It doesn't matter. You should be able to execute on arguments that your partner takes, and I think that a lot of people overcorrect for this. 1ARs tend to overcover arguments that were in the 2 and C for 2 reasons. One is because they've had longer to prep it, so they wrote out more. Arguments that were in the 2 and C, the 1AR has spent more time preparing to answer, which means they generally overcover it, as opposed to arguments that are in the 1 and R. Also, 2Ns are generally silly and go for arguments that they took in the 2 and C in the 2 and R and ignore the 1 and R. So both of those sort of influences cause the 1 and R to seem less important, which you can use to your advantage, right? When I was in high school, we almost always went for the 1 and R, like almost every single round. We always went for T, and it was always in the 1 and R. And that was because people basically always dropped it. Because they were like, Lanning is loud and obnoxious and won't shut up. I'm sure he's going to go for whatever he took in the 2 and C. And then I didn't. So you can take advantage of some of those things, but specializing is also something that can be helpful. Think about the division of labor outside of the debate too. Is another factor that goes into block division of strategy, right? So on my team, the 1 and R, I did all of the politics work, and my partner was busy with the AF, right? They're the 2A, so they have to write and prepare an affirmative. So it makes sense to give the 1 and R an argument that they consistently take. Making the 1 and R take a new complicated position in every debate is going to distract from your affirmative preparation. So in general, I think that the more complicated an argument, or the more prep intensive it is, or the more particular it is, they should go in the 2 and C. Again, that's kind of contrarian advice to what you would normally hear. The final thing that you would generally hear about where to put arguments where is that if it takes longer to prepare something, it should go in the 1 and R. And again, this is particular. Some people prepare really fast and some people prepare really slow. The more that I wrote down, the worse I was going to sound. Right? I was much better with just a couple of words written down and then talking rather than trying to write out everything I was going to say. My partner, Carly Wunderlich, was the exact opposite. She typed out every word of her speech. So some arguments, like case arguments, take some people longer or less time to prepare than others. So that could affect where they go as well, right? Because the 1 and R has a lot more prep time than the 2 and C, just by virtue of having the same amount of prep time and then the entire 2 and C. Is there any other consideration that would affect what argument you would put where? I left the most important one out, so hopefully one of you thinks about this. What about the other team? Anyone? The 1NR occurs later in the debate, right? It's closer to when the 1AR happens. So if there's more of a surprise move, so for instance, if the 2NC takes the counter-planning case, and you get to the 1NR, and there are a couple of things it could be, the affirmative can't begin preparing for their 1AR yet, right? At least on that component of it. If there's the politics dissent and the terrorism dissent that you could extend, it creates that contingency or that opportunity for something to change. So surprise moves should generally be slow played. If you're going to kick out of something, does it make more sense to do it in the 2NC or the 1NR? Generally the 1NR, but again, this is one of those things that, like, if I was the 1N, you wouldn't want that to happen because I'm bad at kicking out of stuff. I always concede the wrong argument or forget to, or drop the bottom. Right, so with exceptions. Everything that I've said with exceptions. Does that make sense? So for all of these are not rules, these are strategic considerations. Right, the cross-examination, your level of expertise, how much preparation time something takes you, how much preparation time something takes for your opponent, whether or not there's an element of surprise. By the way, if you weren't paying attention, I just listed the 5 things I've been rambling about for like 10 minutes, so that was the list of. All of those are considerations, right? None of those are rules, arguments that take longer to cross-ex about must go here, but they're things that you should think about. Does it make sense? So in your conversations about how you're going to divide the block, those are the things you're talking about with your partner. Do you think you can survive a cross-ex on this? Is like a good, honest 1N would be asking their 2N partner that. Do you think you can survive a cross-ex on this? But I'm so much better at T, right? These are the type of considerations that go into our decision about where to put things. Beyond the division of the labor in the block, we have to think about division of labor in the 2NR. So how are we going to save ourselves time later? Is sort of the thesis of giving a good negative block. And one of the rules that I'm going to talk about here now is what I call the principle of 3 to 1. Frank, are you okay? 3 to 1. So what I mean by that is that in the 2AC, on a variety of issues, the affirmative is going to have some ink, right? They'll have 10 little spots, let's say, on a disadvantage. And each of those arguments could be better or worse, right? Does how long an argument takes to make, or how many times the other team makes it, inform the quality of that argument? Sometimes. It's like a tricky question, right? Yes, sometimes reading like 10 really bad cards that say something will get it done. But generally, the length of an argument is not connected to the quality of it, right? Less is sometimes more, right? Like one really smart, true argument that took you 1 sentence to make could no link a dissent, right? Like they could read a spending dissent and you could be like, no link, the plan does not spend any money, right? That's just like that one little thing, but it could. So barring that, right, attaching a caveat to what I'm about to tell you for that, right? Sometimes it doesn't matter how much you cover an argument. If you're just wrong, you're going to lose. You can't outcover the truth. But anyway, you should generally, in the negative block, try to have 3 responses, A, B, C, to everything that they have said. And the reason I say that is sort of a law of coverage, that the 1AR cannot answer everything that you say. They just can't. Even if you went through every argument in the 2AC and just said one thing in response to it, like they said A, I say B, they say B, I say C, right? The 1AR could not, no matter how much faster they were than you. I've been in debate for a long time. I've been in probably 1,000 debates, and I can recall like 2 or 3 of them where the 2AC spread out the block. It has happened. It's kind of funny when it happens. The negative block drops arguments that the 2AC said because they're so slow. But generally, the 1AR is going to drop something that you said in the block. The question is, how do you win a debate because of that, right? If you're good at debate, you should win after the 1AR has dropped some of these arguments. If you're not that good, then you won't capitalize on that advantage, and the affirmative will still win even though they didn't answer everything. So you need to branch arguments, and you need to penalize the affirmative for failing to cover them. So Adrian's going to talk after this in the 1AR lecture about how you have to make choices and pick particular things and then get rid of certain parts of the debate. So your job as the negative is to punish them for not extending everything. So in the demo debate, did you notice how when we were negative, right? I can't even remember this year's demo debate, but I know that any debate that I was in, I go to useless sheets of paper. You'll hear mixed reviews on this, right? Some people will be like, that's a waste of time, it makes your judge angry, but I was a big believer in hiding arguments elsewhere, right? Creating a cost for not taking out of a sheet of paper. You don't have to do this on different sheets of paper either, right? It could all be on one. It could be on the politics dissent. You could say Link turns the case during the Link part of the debate instead of at the top. Does that make sense? You could make an additional argument on the link debate so that if they chose not to go for their link turns and didn't answer that, there would be a cost to them. So part of what coverage during the block is creating a bunch of ink, but it's not just, I want to be really particular about how I phrase this, because if you read like 20 uniqueness cards to answer their one uniqueness card, is that a good investment of your time? Because what's going to happen if they don't answer uniqueness? Well, you won uniqueness. Can you double win uniqueness or triple win it? No. Does it make sense? So there are diminishing returns in some things. Everything that you overcover in the block is something that you undercover. This was a lesson that it took me a really long time to learn. And my coaches had to force out of me. Because I would be like, but who cares if I overcover this uniqueness and link thing? I'll just read 5 extra uniqueness cards and link cards and we'll never lose on that. It's like, well, you're going to lose on the thing that you drop. You might not lose on it. Does it make sense? So for every overcorrection that you make to overcover something, you are undercovering something else. Because there are 2 types of coverage in debate, especially when you're negative: horizontal and vertical. Has anyone heard those expressions before? Vertical proliferation, horizontal proliferation, or coverage, or ink. So by vertical, I mean down the sheet of paper. So if you read 2 off in the 1 in C, and then the negative block was just that one sheet of paper, we're just extending the capitalism critique, which, by the way, you could do that and still meet all of the strategic advice that I've given above. You could still have a couple of options even on one sheet of paper, right? Option 1 could be we're going to kick the alt and just go for it as an impact turn. Option 2 could be, does that make sense? We're going to win framework and win that they can't weigh their AV. Option 3 is we're going to win the root. Does it make sense? There are different flavors of things. Or we're going to go for ethics versus extinction. Those could be 2 different paths to victory on the same sheet of paper. So you don't always necessarily need more distinct options in order to have a diversity of options. So vertical proliferation is what you'll generally hear with one-off strategies, or narrowing in the block. And the benefits of this are that in the 1AR, it is very difficult for them to correctly allocate their time between sections of the debate. So if you extend a disadvantage in the 2 and C, just the disadvantage, and spend a lot of time on each part of it, it's going to be very long by the end. It's hard for some 1ARs, especially in high school, to know when to jump to the next section, as they spend too much time overcovering. Where are they more likely to waste time and spend their time overcovering? If it's vertical. If you're trying to spread them out vertically, where should you hide arguments? Or where are they least likely to get to answer arguments?
Lower on the flow.
Lower on the flow. When is that not true? When you're debating someone that's good. Okay. So the next type is horizontal proliferation, which is what I was kind of strategically referencing above. This is a bunch of different sheets of paper. So the block is going to extend topicality and a disadvantage and a counterplan and have answers on each of the advantages. The benefit here is that people are really inefficient at moving between pages. They spend too long, so if let's say that you only needed to spend 5 seconds getting rid of an argument on politics, you are going to spend more than 5 seconds. It just doesn't happen that people spend the transition between pieces of paper and the tendency to talk too much about a particular thing means that will generally work in your favor. Caveats. What if you spend too much time on it? Then it's a waste of your time. Or, what if the judge misses everything? That's another thing that I think people don't really think about when they go for this strategy, is a lot of times your judges miss the first 10 seconds and last 10 seconds that you say on anything. Because they are humans, right? So they have to flip over a piece of paper and does it move their pen and start writing again. So never make really important arguments really quickly during a transition. This is something that you'll see with people that have coverage problems. Like you're getting to the bottom of the 2 and C and you have 10 seconds left. And you're like, oh my god, I have to say this really important thing. That is dangerous, right? Important things you should say completely. You should not rush to say those. So in that scenario, you would want to just have the 1 and R say it, right? Okay. So the way that you do all of this, we talked in disadvantages a little bit about link and uniqueness walls. I want to talk more about just generally coverage extension walls and what it means to create a wall of arguments in the block. How do you start an extension? Y'all are like the worst audience ever today. And if you don't stop talking to her, seriously, yeah, I can see you. Don't act all surprised. Yes?
They say blank, we say blank. They're wrong.
Not the mechanics. So start by extending your stuff, right? So the first thing you identify what you're answering, and then you extend your original argument. Yes? And then new stuff. What is the hierarchy for what we should be inserting? Why read a new card? What does it accomplish? So if you have a better piece of evidence than the one you read in the 1 and C that's like higher quality, that has more diverse warrants or better qualifications, or is longer, you could read that. If it introduces a new argument that's in a similar vein. So identify, extend, new, and then they say, and then the specific thing that they said, right? Why is it so important to do this mechanically in the block as opposed to other speeches? Like the 2AC doesn't always have to do that, right? The 2AC is not like, they have said that the disad is unique and now I will, right? There's something distinct about the block doing this, that mechanics that matter. Why? Why is it so important? Yes. Excuse me?
You have to win those arguments.
You have to win in the block. But again, remember the block is your chance to explain stuff. If the judge misses something in the block but begins to understand it in the 2NR, you have already lost. The block is basically your first and last chance to get the judge to understand something completely. Like, good is good enough, we'll get it done in the 2AC. If the judge doesn't completely understand your response to a critique, for instance, in the 2AC, you might still win the debate. Something might happen somewhere else. Or in the 1AR, the judge might be like, oh, that is what that meant. Does that make sense? That actually happens a lot in debates, especially high school debates. You find yourself looking at it and you're like, oh my god, I just understood what they were trying to say. That thing that they've been talking about for like 10 minutes, I get it. You want that moment to happen for you in the block when you are negative. If it happens in the 2NR, it's too late. One of the most important strategic principles of giving a good negative block is identifying pivot points in the debate that could be central to turning it. So possession arrow type questions. So permutations are a good example of this. Competition is one of those things that can be completely distinct from other sections of the debate and lose it for you. Questions of fairness, whether they're about topicality or theory or about framework, anything that has a fairness value associated with it can frequently be independent. The word turns in all of its iterations in debate is the classic example of one of those pivot points, right? Hegemony isn't good, it's actually bad. The plan doesn't hurt the war on terror, it actually helps it. All of those arguments flip offense in the other direction. So when you're negative, in the 2NR, the way to defeat a turn is to have given a block that had a series of roadblocks. So one of the things that you should include in your wall are link shields, or turn shields. The impact can only go one direction. So a lot of times on hegemony, you'll hear this argument that the question is not whether hegemony is up or down, it's how effectively we use it. Hegemony is inevitable. The United States will always have a very powerful military. The question is whether or not we choose to effectively deploy that military. So if they impact turn hedge, it can't be hedge good versus bad, it's just hedge effective versus not. That is a turn shield. Those type of arguments built into your walls in the 2NC are how you defeat those arguments in the 2NR. So built-in screens. If you've ever played sports, like the idea of a pick is like a decent one to think of it. Like you're setting yourself up and creating a strategic roadblock for them that they can't get through that will later create an opportunity. So take the argument that you would like to make in the 2NR in regards to some of these pivot points, branch it into 3 different arguments, and then put it in the block. Even if they win the link turn, no turns is like a really, 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 really important one to reverse engineer. So a lot of the advice that I've given you so far is to brainstorm things that you want to do in the 2NR, and then think of ways to put them back into the 2NC and the 1NR. One of the best ways to do this is to watch videos of yourself. To watch an entire debate of yourself where you are negative, and then list what went wrong in the 2NR, and then go back and put it in there. Watching a real debate will help a lot with that, though. Other pivot points. Anything that has a fairness concern. Anything that uses the word turn. What's another one? Think of an argument that when you're negative, that you can lose the entire debate. Thematically, that the affirmative uses a lot. Yes?
Framework.
Framework, but framework is generally, if it's not a fairness concern, you probably can't lose the debate on just that. And we can talk about why that's true in a second, but you did other stuff in the debate that was good. Just by showing up to a debate, you probably learned something, right? Like reading your 1AC. Yes?
Theory.
Here, but other than the two things, so competition, what we should be debating about, or you debated unfairly, or you cheated, or you made the debate uneducational. Bracketing all of those arguments, right? Those are all concerns that you could lose the debate on just those. Those are, yes, permutations, theory arguments, topicality arguments, these are all very high on the list of you could lose the debate on just this. But what are other pivot points? We already talked about turns, right? Switching the direction of offense. So like a link turn, or like the disadd turns the case. Yes?
Case outweighs.
Outweighs, right? Even if, so all of these are even if statements, right? Does everyone see how these are even if statements? Even if you think the counterplan solves the case, it's not competitive, vote affirmative. Even if you think they want a link, our link turn is better, vote. Does it make sense? So what we're doing is we're predicting what the even if statements of the 2AR are going to be. That's the art of giving a 2NR. So it's like we're reverse engineering the reverse engineering. A good 2NR is just a game of Nostradamus about what the 2AR is going to say. If they say this, then we, so it's tracing it back even further. But yes, outweighs. So the sections of the block that need to be very robust are anywhere that could potentially contain one of these pivot points. So think of the different places where the affirmative will challenge the competition of whatever you have to solve the case. Where they will challenge the direction of links. Well, they will challenge the direction of impacts. Or they will challenge the magnitude of impacts, or the sequencing, I think is a better way than magnitude to think of that. What is the sequencing of impacts in the judge's decision calculus? What should come first? Because that could be because of magnitude or time frame or probability, or because of a relationship to other impacts in a causal chain, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be one of those. But in what order will the judge decide that things matter? Those are pivot points. That's what a pivot point in the debate is. Something that could change the judge's decision calculus and make them think that something else is more important. Turns, outweighs, doesn't compete, voting issue. Those four buzzwords, if you are negative, whenever you hear those, the block should have a substantial portion of its time devoted to those. Do those arguments always come out in the 2AC? No. Who said that? Yay, you were right. No, those arguments do not always come out in the 2AC. Sometimes those arguments don't come out until the 2AR. Sometimes you will not hear the exact phrasing of our hegemony advantage outweighs the terrorism dissent until the very end of the debate, right? And sometimes the affirmative will even still win. So knowing which sections of the debate you need to build in screens, you need to put in turn shields, and which you need to spend more of your time speaking about and elaborating, going into detail and being persuasive, all of those are really important for giving the negative block. Can anyone think of a final pivot point? We've talked about offense, right? Of switching the direction of offense, of outweighing offense or coming before it in terms of proceeding in the judge's calculus. We've talked about you cheated. We've talked about, what's the last one?
I guess like link debate.
But what type? So we've talked about offense, we've talked about theory, we've talked about competition. What is another strategic type of debate arguments which exists? It's like the partner of offense. Like a complete takeout, or a concession. What about something that you dropped earlier in the debate? What about something in the 1 and C that you dropped? Concessions become a huge pivot point later in the debate, right? Because both teams will probably drop something at some point. So a huge portion of the debate is spent figuring out what to do with conceded truth claims. So now that you have conceded that hegemony is inevitable, what impacts does it? So if you're negative and you don't answer one of the central claims of the hegemony advantage in the 1 and C, have you lost the debate? Maybe. You could have just lost the debate, but probably not just because of that, right? So, in addition to the things above that I said you should spend more time on because they can switch the direction of the debate and they can become pivot points later in the 2NR, these are things that you will lose debates on in the 2NR. Concessions are one of those things that you spent too little time or you answered incorrectly. That also happens. Like even when I was very successful in college and good, sometimes, like one time my partner Carly looked over at me and was like, I'm pretty sure we just answered this advantage backwards. As in like we just read a bunch of new impacts for them. And she was totally right, right? Sometimes that happens. So, a key way to give a good 2 and R is to identify the arguments you are most likely to lose on in the 2 and R and reverse engineer into your block all of those arguments. This is the final kind of like strategic section of this before we talk about a couple of specific arguments. It's just thinking like the affirmative. One of the keys to negative strategy in the earlier and later phases of debate, which is really how you should think of this, right? It's like a game of Monopoly. Like, what do you do on the first turn? What do you do on the 200th turn? Debate is a strategy game. So think like the affirmative. A couple of different theories that I want to talk about. The first is the theory of the raccoon backed into a corner. If any of you have ever seen the wild animal, the raccoon, are you familiar with it? It's a very dangerous animal. Very cute from a distance, but if you start to go up towards it, they get mean, right? So they're like friendly when they're in wide open spaces, but if you back it into a corner, it will like claw your face. So the idea behind this is that sometimes you can win a debate too much. If you are winning too much, what happens? Well, no, you're winning too much. You're going to lose. What happens? What does your opponent do when you are just whooping that booty? Yes.
They do something like really unpredictable.
Unpredictable. Are we scared of unpredictable things?
Yes.
Yes, we are. So think of this like an equation. The more you are winning, the more likely your opponent is to do something ridiculous and crazy. Some people are not afraid of that. Some people, totally cool. Right? Like I think of debaters as like good on script and good off script. Like there are some people that when things just like get all ridiculous and like way different than everyone thought they were going to be at the beginning, they like thrive in that environment and other people panic. But the theory of the raccoon backed into a corner says that your opponent is most dangerous when you have them cornered. That is the moment at which they are most likely to do something completely unpredictable that you didn't calculate before. Remember, the thesis of all of this advice has been to think backwards and to reverse engineer the block around the 2 and R. So what is the thing you thought about the least? Well, that would be the eject button. So when you're thinking like the affirmative, what would you do if you were losing the debate?
Wipe out.
Wipe out. You could always impact turn with something stupid. Wipe out. Yes?
I mean, if you have no hope, you can always kick the app and go for some tangent.
Kick the AF. That sounds like it would fundamentally change the way that we were thinking about the debate, wouldn't it? Yeah?
Yeah, go for condo.
When does the AF do all these things, by the way? When does the AF hit the eject button? After the block. Right, so, okay, so we just reverse engineered, right? We thought backwards. We gave a 2 and R that was responding to an affirmative that only went for conditionality and we lost. How do we fix that? Why? We give a better block. Either by not winning so much that they think they have to go for conditionality, tone it back a little bit. Don't, like win 90%, not 100%. Or we could overcover theory in the block. So one rule that was true for debaters at Michigan State was that if they said voting issue in the 2AC, regardless of what it was, you had to spend a minute answering it in the block, which is really dumb. And I wouldn't say like archaically do that exact formula, but the principle was that we thought we were going to win most debates that we had on the substance. So it was worth always investing a serious amount of time on theory just to make sure that you beat theory in the block, I guess is the takeaway. The time to defeat theory arguments when you are negative is in the negative block. You do not win them in the 2 and R. So you should overcompensate. And again, bearing in mind the strategic advice above, everything that you overcover is something that you are undercovering. So if you spend more time on theory, you're spending less time on the link debate, you're spending less time on the alternative, you're spending less time on the right, something. It's coming from somewhere. Debate has a finite amount of time. You have 13 minutes in the block. It's going somewhere, right? But in my professional opinion, in the 2 and C and the 1 and R, spending more time on theory is a good idea because that's where you're going to win it. That's true of all arguments, but especially true of that argument because you just don't have the explanatory power in the 2 and R. You can also discourage them from ever even going for it, which when you're negative is a huge boon, right? It's a massive win. If you can raise the cost of the affirmative, even extending theory in the 1AR, that is oftentimes a good decision for you. Yeah.
I guess, do you think we should answer like the theoretical arguments on the same piece of paper where they put
Yes.
it?
The whole new sheet of paper thing is so stupid. It's a waste of paper, and also all of your judges have their own way of flowing. That's what I don't understand about that. Like when you insist that your judge flow something a particular way, it just bugs me. Because like I have been doing this a very long time. I don't line up arguments either. So the like, it doesn't make sense. Like basically, let your judge flow how they want to flow. I think in almost 90% of instances, but that's off button. So think like the affirmative. If you are winning too much, they will likely do something unpredictable. The way that you counteract that is by building in more time on their eject button strategies in the block, or by not winning as much. An eject button strategy is, oh my gosh, the plane is hitting the mountain. What do we do? Like everything the 2AC said was wrong. We are going to lose the debate. We are so bad at debate. We should quit. Just kidding, conditionality, right? So when you're affirmative, I'm sure that the 2AC lecture talked about this. You want some of these, right? You could kick the whole case and just go for one of your stupid add-ons, right? Eject button. The second one is true, not new. So this is probably the most important and difficult concept for high school debaters to understand, but when you're judging and there's a bunch of things that are dropped and you have to resolve something, a lot of times you end up voting on new arguments because they're correct. So even if the 2AR is the first time that the affirmative says something, if they're completely right about it and there's no debate to evaluate, a lot of times judges will just vote for it. And it's very frustrating for people that are still competing because you're like, but they didn't say that until it's like, but literally two ships passing in the night, what do I do? So if something is dropped and you're winning by a ton, you should go ahead and answer the argument they're likely to make, in my professional opinion. I think that's one of the best moves the block can make. So earlier I was like, the worst blocks extend everything. That happens when your opponents don't answer stuff, right? So if they drop your disad, what should you do instead of, if they drop the whole 1 and C, what should you do instead of just extending everything? You should still make choices, you should still kick some things, but what do you spend your time doing?
Explaining the argument, and like being
Girl, they dropped. They didn't challenge any of them. Why do you have to re-explain them?
I mean, you gotta be predictive of like what, like
That's getting closer, but I'm getting off.
Answering the best arguments that they can.
Answering the best arguments that they have made from other places, right? So answering applications before they have done it is one good one, right? What did they say? Right? They didn't drop everything. So one argument the affirmative always makes against a disadvantage is case outweighs, right? They don't even have to say that on the disadvantage to be making that argument, right? If they extended their advantages, they're intuitively saying case outweighs. So in answering obvious or intuitive cross applications is one way that you should definitely spend your time. And then remember the cautionary note of true isn't new. If it's true, it's not new, right? If there's something super obvious in response to your argument, the affirmative is probably at some point going to say it. The 1AR, if let's say the 2AC dropped a disad and you're extending the disad, what is the 1AR going to do? They're going to try to make answers to it, right? So in addition to being like, you shouldn't get new arguments, you should also just answer the most obvious and intuitive cross applications first, and then just intuitive responses second. What is the best way to make that you shouldn't get new arguments if you're negative in the block? How should you phrase that argument? Everyone type this down almost verbatim. Strategic decisions in the negative block are informed by 2AC coverage choices. It means allowing new 1AR arguments destroys negative strategy. We only get one chance to generate offense. That is inefficient, but does everyone get the idea behind that argument? This is not just you shouldn't get to make new arguments, it's we chose to do something in the block based off where they allocated their time in the 2AC, and we don't get another block. If you let the 1AR give a second 2AC, we lose every debate. The reason that the 1AR should not get to make new arguments is because it happens after the negative block. So remember, backwards to all of the preceding things that make the block special. The reason why we give the negative 2 speeches in a row is to counteract the persuasive appeal and strategic power of speaking last. The affirmative gets to speak last. That is huge. They already start with a massive advantage, which means the negative block is the only chance for the negative to win the debate. Block decisions are made off the 2AC. Okay. The final think like the affirmative principle is on every single argument, ask yourself, what would I do? Oftentimes, too, if you're doing this correctly, you're the 2N and your partner is the 2A, you literally can ask them, what would you do? Like a little partner check, I think is a very good idea during the block. Anticipate the 1AR before it happens. What would you do? So the best debaters are constantly evaluating the debate. They literally judge it themselves. Like, I think this argument is only okay, we need to spend more time here. But I think it's also important that you ask yourself, what would I do if I was in their position? Which of these arguments would I extend? Which of our cards is the worst? What is the weakest part of our argument? What is the strongest part of their argument? These are like the fundamental negative strategy questions. So 5 basic rules for the 2NR that synthesize a lot of this. Thou shalt cover their best arguments. You should spend the most time in the negative block talking about the 2AC's best responses. What makes a response best? Well, 1, how much sense it makes to you. Imagine if you were judging. I think that this is different for different people and depends on context, right? But you should constantly be in a process of evaluating the quality of arguments. You should spend the most time answering their best arguments. Branching is a very good strategy here. Take whatever you want to say and break it up into pieces. They are wrong for 3 reasons, A, B, and C. The important thing here, though, is to not just mechanically do that. A, B, and C need to be different, or else it doesn't accomplish anything. So distinct warrants. Distinctions with a difference. You should also cover your worst arguments. What is the weakest part of your disadvantage? This, again, can be a double-edged sword. If you spend a bunch of time talking about your stupid internal link, it might draw attention to it. So again, everything in debate is a strategic balance. There are costs and benefits to every decision you make. But in general, I would recommend that you overcover or overcorrect for the weakness of your argument by spending more time explaining it. Their best argument, your worst argument. A final cautionary note, this is not really like a rule, but you don't noob the cross-ex. This always happens at least a couple of times before you figure it out. Like, you do not ask the 2NC about something they messed up. Does everyone know that? Everyone wrote that down? Yeah. I was really bad about doing that, yeah.
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Don't ask the 2NC about things that they messed up. So during the cross-examination, you should never be like, but you totally didn't answer this thing that we said. Because they will be like, thank you so much, my partner will answer that. That's one of my favorite things to say in cross-ex. Like, you are right. I definitely did drop that. Gotcha. This was a trap. No. But that does happen. So think strategically about the cross-examination, which happens in the middle of the block. Diversity of arguments, either on different sheets of paper or on the same sheet of paper, different paths to victory. Different combinations of different arguments. This can also be different points of emphasis if you're a one-off team, or if you're a team that doesn't necessarily organize your arguments that way. So when I debated for the University of Houston, we made arguments only about disability, and sometimes it would just be one sheet of paper, but other times it would be like 5 off. We would just compartmentalize it differently. But you should think about, even if your argument has one thesis, different points of emphasis that you could make on it. So there's a potential 2NR where we rely heavily on the alternative solving the case, and there's a potential 2NR where we don't even talk about the alternative. There's a potential 2NR where we completely win framework and win that they shouldn't get their affirmative at all, and there's a potential 2NR where we just kind of win it, or we compromise. So a diversity of options does not necessarily mean a diversity of off-case arguments. A good 2NR could go for just a counterplane and a case advantage if you had done it correctly before. So distinct options. And then the final one is execution. What argument should you go for in the 2NR? Well, it depends, but the likeliest answer is whichever one you executed on best. And I will attach a series of cautionary notes to that. If you're putting together your 1NC correctly, you should be able to go for everything in the 1NC. This is one of the most foolish things that I hear high school students say. Be like, oh my gosh, they dropped our T argument, but we can't go for it because it's so stupid. It's like, well, why did you read it? If you can't go for something in the 2NR, it should never be in the 1NC. In my professional opinion, like never. And you'll hear some people say differently. They'll be like, no, you should read ACE-BAC because it'll take a little bit of their time. I agree that you should have some things like that in your arsenal, You should have like a trolley procedural that you're good at. But if you can't win on your trolley procedural, then it's not very threatening. And again, I think that you should debate for your best opponent, not your worst opponent. If you are presuming that you will win a debate because your opponents are bad, you are bad at debate. You should prepare as if you are debating the best person that you could ever debate. Could you win on this argument against your opponent at their best? Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is a couple of different tricks for little subgenres of arguments. So, executing in the block for procedural arguments that are like topicality and fairness. I've already given you a couple of my thoughts about theory, which is, I only said one thing about it. Excuse me? When do you beat theory? In the block. How do you do that? Overcover it. What are the potential risks of overcovering it? Grab something else. What are the potential benefits? They won't extend it. Oh my gosh, see? Some of you are paying attention. That's so great. It's a little review session. Okay, but topicality. A couple of tricks in executing in the block. One is that I think that debaters in high school are poor at proliferating the implications to these arguments, right? So you should think of this just like a disad. The part of the debate that gets under-debated, especially in the 2NC1 and R in high school, is the impact. Why does it matter? What are the distinct and discrete impacts? How do you compare impacts? And again, part of this is think of the debates where you've gone for, how many of you have gone for topicality and lost in the 2NR? Have you ever lost a debate on team when you went for it? Things that the judge says afterwards. I didn't think that your interpretation X, Y, or Z. I thought, how many of you lost on the affirmative meets your interpretation? Probably not that many. You did. It's okay. I've lost on it too. So most of the time when you lose topicality debates, it's not because of defense, right? It's not because the affirmative meets your interpretation. It's because your interpretation isn't good. Or their interpretation is better. So spending more time on the areas of the debate where you lost in the 2NR, in the negative block is how you correct for that. How do we fix execution problems in the 2NR? Allocating time differently in the block. Spending more time on the arguments that we lost on and less time on the arguments that became less relevant afterwards. So the only way to get better at negative strategy is to continue to do it. And if you're giving practice speeches that only simulate part of the debate, you are not successfully practicing on the negative. Topicality, the most frequent decision that you're going to hear why you lost when you're negative, is because you did not do enough impact calculus or you did not win that your interpretation was superior. So I think diversifying those impacts in the block is incredibly important. That's true of all procedural arguments too. Impact calculus, not length distinctions. Disadvantages. The key to executing a disadvantage in the block are walls. And having shields to different arguments. And anticipating whether the affirmative is likely to go for offense on the disadvantage or use the case to outweigh it. Because I think that one mistake that negatives will make is sometimes over-covering some of their arguments that the affirmative does not intend to challenge. I think that is one of the biggest mistakes that you can make on offensive arguments like a disadvantage or a critique, is you spend too long explaining the link, and then the affirmative never talks about it again. Think about the time trade-off involved in the affirmative and the 2AC saying, no link because, like a really quick argument, and then the negative block spends like 4 minutes on the link debate because you had a block, so you just read your whole link thing. So bracketing all of the advice I've given above, I think on offensive positions like criticisms and disadvantages, that you have to be very careful not to waste your own time. The cautionary note that I would attach for the block that's distinct from the strategic advice that I gave above is be careful not to waste your own time and make sure that if you are investing time in something, that it creates a cost for the affirmative. Either it will take them, either it's something they have to extend, and therefore will take them a long time to answer and get through, like case arguments, right? If you spend a long time on all parts of the case, they probably have to extend it. The link debate is another place where you can lose a lot of it. So if you're going to do that, hide arguments in there that create cost for them for not going to cover it. So link turns the case is a good one. Or this is also a solvency deficit. This takes out their solvency. This is a reason the counterplan is better. All of those types of arguments, if you add to different sections of the debate, it can help you. On a counterplan, the block, it is incredibly important that you win competition. The 4 priorities on a counterplan in the block are competition, doesn't link to the net benefit, it's theoretically legitimate, and it solves the case in that order. The thing that should scare you the most in the block when you're executing on a counterplan is competition. Permutation questions. If you are not decisively ahead on competition in the block, I think you're probably going to lose. This is one of the arguments that it's easiest for the affirmative in the 1AR to make a bunch of new arguments. Think about a permutation debate as it evolves throughout the debate. It starts with 3 words generally. The affirmative says 3 words. And then you have to spend a ton of time in the block. The 1AR gets to say a bunch of new things. So based off what we have said so far about being afraid of the 2NR because it's so difficult because you have to respond and predict, the block is when you have to defeat a permutation argument. Generally, you should just be right about competition too. If you think your counterplan might not be competitive, you should not read it. This is not one of the things generally where like a stack of cards or like really good debating will help you. You are generally either right or wrong. Sometimes you're debating people that are bad, but again, we debate for our opponents at their best. But competition, I think, is one thing that the block needs to be very on top of for counterplans. The affirmative says 3 words, then you spend about 3 minutes responding to it. You need to make darn sure that you have said everything you could possibly say. Permutations are the one area of the debate where the block most has to anticipate what the 1AR will say that is different than the 2AC. The 1AR is given the most leeway on this argument to make new applications, to say new things, to basically invent new arguments. So lower on the sequence was doesn't link to the net benefit. So right after competition, it's competitive. Then after that was theory, and then after that was solves the case. Why would I put solves the case at the lowest priority on a counterplan for the block? Anyone? Isn't that the whole point of a counterplan?
You could lose that and still win.
Yes. Can you lose those previous 3 things and win the debate? Maybe. Maybe. No. You definitely can't lose the first one. If you lose competition, you're going to lose. You could lose that it links to one of the net benefits. What do you get? Multiple net benefits. Right, so number 2, maybe. But you're right. A counterplan that only solves half of the case could still be part of a winning 2NR. Counterplans very infrequently solve the whole case. So the hierarchy of priorities in the negative block for coverage is winning competition and winning theory and winning that there is a distinction between the plan and the counterplan in terms of the net benefit. Then solvency. Most high school debaters invert that. They spend all of their time talking about why the counterplan solves the case and then lose on a permutation. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about briefly is executing on a critique in the negative block. How do you win competition for a critique? I just ranted about the scariness of competition and about how permutations are structured to benefit the affirmative, which is why the block has to answer a bunch of arguments that haven't been made. Is that also true for a critique? It's even more true for a critique. Permutations are tests of the link, right? A permutation is a way of saying your links are not good enough to justify excluding us from your alternative. So the part of a criticism that it is most important to overcover in the block, and that the affirmative will get the most leeway in the 1AR, which will therefore be the scariest for the 2NR, is the link debate. When is there an exception to that, however? Yes?
If they just straight turn that back.
Yeah. Sometimes the debate on a critique is about framework instead of that, right? Sometimes the affirmative will be like, yes, we obviously link, because our advantage is hegemony, but nobody cares about this. Right? So there are again, repeating this again because it's the most important piece of advice, there is no universal advice in debate. There is no piece of strategic advice that you can go apply every time and win. There is not a single thing that a single instructor here will tell you that is always true. There just isn't. There are considerations that you have to take into account, right? So if your link is just absolutely true, then you should spend less time on it. But generally, more times than not, the place that you will lose the debate on the criticism in the block is by undercovering the link debate there. And again, the strategic considerations that inform all of these things that we've talked about for the particulars are the same, right? So different things on topicality, counterplans, dissads, and critiques matter in the block, but the strategic considerations that inform them are the same for all of them. Can you survive a cross-examination on this? which arguments will the judge allow the affirmative to make the most new responses to? Okay, so I am basically done, but I want to summarize a couple of concepts very briefly before we talk about the 2NR tomorrow. So the key concept going forward is to think backwards. Identify all of the things that you did wrong in the 2NR, and don't think of it as a 2NR redo. Think of it as a block redo. It's a to-do list or a list of advice for how you could change your block to anticipate that. Problems in the 2NR start in the 1NC and should be fixed in the block. There are obviously things that you can do to give a more effective 2NR. We're going to talk about that tomorrow, but the thesis of advice I will give you always going forward for negative strategy is that you have to win in the block. The block is the one chance for the negative to overcome the advantages that the affirmative gets of speaking first and last and choosing what we talk about. Coverage is extremely important in the block, giving yourself options. Evaluating the benefits of horizontal versus vertical coverage or proliferation. Thinking like the affirmative. Right, so all of these considerations are going to go into our discussion tomorrow where we're going to talk about how to give a winning 2NR. Before we do that, does anyone have any questions? Yes?
You're talking about like strategic concessions and stuff, but like in the Houston circuit, opponents or judges will like freak out if you drop anything.
Yes. So again, a lot of the advice that I've given is assuming that you have a judge that is experienced with debate or experienced with the type of debate that I've been talking about. There are definitely some circuits where if you drop something you will lose, even if it's like. So you have to apply this advice through a filter of where you debate. If you debate in a region that's like that, I would say that it's very important that you talk about everything, but in my experience with those type of judges in Houston, it doesn't matter how much you say. Does that make sense? Like, so you have, if you're negative and you read T in some places, you have to extend T. You're not allowed to kick stuff. My advice would be to still prioritize covering a couple of arguments, still make choices, but just talk about everything in each of your speeches if you're going to lose because you don't. Anyone else? Yes?
So, for going one off, what would you recommend? Like, who would like pick the terms or like solve all the solvency deficit?
So remember, I shied away from giving specific advice on that, right? There are a couple of things that you need to think about. Are you and your partner, how you and your partner are situated? Who of you did more research on this? Who of you is more familiar with the argument? I think when you're talking about a one-off position, the person that does the link debate should be whoever is more proficient on that argument. The permutation and link is the most important part. In my opinion, it should generally go in the 2NC because it's something you need the most time on. And that's the kind of thing that if you can't survive a cross-ex on the link to your one-off criticism, you have already lost. It's not like the politics is you have already lost if you cannot answer a question. Does that make sense? That's a cross-ex that should help you instead of hurt you. But it depends. Yes? Yes?
I still don't really get how do you build a shield?
Excuse me?
You said about building a shield.
Oh, so like a turn shield. Uniqueness is one way that you can do that. So if you control the direction of uniqueness, can it be a turn? No. If the TPA is already going to pass, can the affirmative make it more pass? No. So controlling uniqueness is the best type of link shield, right? And you can think of applications of that that are distinct. But it's already going to happen, so they can't make it happen more. Another one that I always use on politics, and I'm sure Adrian talked about, is just controversy as opposed to popularity, unpopularity. Our link argument is that you cause a fight. It's not about who wins the fight, right? So even if the plan is 90% popular, 10% unpopular, the 10% of people that oppose it are loud, obnoxious Republicans like Donald Trump. So it doesn't matter that the vast majority of people support the plan. There will still be a huge fight about it. Does that make sense? That is the type of link shield. So even if they win their link turn, basically all link shields or all impact turn shields are just even if statements. Even if they win this, we still win because. Even if they win it, it doesn't matter because. But uniqueness is a good one. And honestly, too, a lot of it is just like a little spin. Like that, our link is about, it's distinctions that establish a difference. So our link is not popularity, unpopularity, it's controversy, which means they can't win a turn. Okay. Do you want them to take a break or just one more question? Yes?
Oh, yeah, can you explain the principle of 3 to 1 again?
Okay, so think about roughly the affirmative strategic priorities in the 2AC. So if they say non-unique and read 2 uniqueness cards, generally you want to expand that. Does that make sense? Branching into A, B, and C. And that, I think it's highly contextual depending on how fast you are, what type of region you debate in, what type of argument it is. But my general principle was when the 2AC said something, like builder blocks, I wanted like 3 little responses next to it. You want to, the idea, and again, the numbers are not important, the rough proportion is, you want it to go out. When the affirmative says something, you want to have more coverage next to it in the block. But again, the attached caveat to this was a 1-sentence true argument cannot be, you can't outcover the truth. So even if you said a million things, if you're just wrong, but on the margins, right? Generally. Okay. Anyone else? Yay! Do you want to take a little break?